Hey guys, tonight we're finding out exactly why you couldn't handle medieval women. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If your image of a medieval woman comes from fairy tales, romantic paintings, or films where she spends her afternoons gazing from a castle window while waiting for a handsome knight to return home, history has some disappointing news. That version certainly existed in songs and poetry, but everyday life was considerably less glamorous and contained far more mud. The average medieval woman wasn't waiting for adventure. She was too busy making sure everyone made it to the next sunrise. Life in the Middle Ages rewarded one quality above all others: usefulness. Charm was pleasant, good looks were appreciated, but neither could milk a cow, repair a torn cloak, preserve enough food for winter, or stop the roof from leaking during 3 days of relentless rain. Medieval women learned these lessons early because they had little choice. Survival depended on competence, not convenience. From dawn until long after sunset, their work rarely stopped. Water had to be hauled from wells or streams. Fires had to be kept alive because relighting one could take considerable effort. Bread wasn't bought, it was baked. Clothes weren't replaced. They were repaired repeatedly until the fabric surrendered completely. Livestock needed feeding. Gardens demanded attention. Cheese had to be made. Ale had to be brewed, because drinking questionable water every day was an excellent way to become a historical footnote. By the time you were congratulating yourself for successfully putting on both boots, she had probably completed enough work to qualify for an entire modern productivity podcast. And it wasn't simply physical labour. A medieval woman often carried an astonishing amount of knowledge entirely in her memory. She knew when to sow grain, when to harvest herbs, how much flour remained in storage, which neighbour owned the wandering goat currently eating the vegetables, which child was developing a fever, and whether the smoked meat hanging above the hearth would last another month or only another week. There was no notebook, no calendar notification, no helpful message reminding her that winter was approaching. Winter had an unfortunate habit of reminding people itself. Even among the nobility, life was hardly one endless banquet. Noblewomen frequently supervised enormous estates while their husbands disappeared to fight wars, attend court, or pursue glory in distant lands. Someone still had to collect rents, oversee servants, settle disputes between tenants, inspect harvests, and make sure enough food reached everyone living on the estate. The castle didn't magically organise itself. Despite what fantasy stories occasionally suggest, castles were less like luxury hotels and more like oversized businesses that happened to have defensive walls. If something went wrong, hundreds of people could feel the consequences. This is where many modern assumptions begin to fall apart. Medieval women were not passive passengers in history. They were managers, planners, healers, negotiators, farmers, merchants, mothers, and problem solvers. Their responsibilities were rarely optional because there simply wasn't anyone else available to do them. The Middle Ages had a wonderfully efficient management philosophy. If you were capable of doing the job, congratulations. It was now your permanent job. Annual performance reviews were replaced with something much simpler: whether everyone survived the winter. By the end of this journey, you'll probably discover something unexpected. The difficult part about living with a medieval woman wouldn't have been her expectations. It would have been realizing she could meet every one of them herself. And she'd quietly notice that you couldn't. If you believe waking up before 7 in the morning is an impressive achievement, a medieval woman would probably have considered you halfway through your lunch break. The day often began long before sunrise. Without electric lights, people naturally followed the rhythm of daylight, but work couldn't always wait for the sun to appear. Fires needed attention before they died completely during the night. Animals expected feeding regardless of the weather. Bread dough had to be prepared hours before anyone planned to eat it. Water had to be fetched before the household became busy. There was no snooze button. The rooster was the snooze button. And he was famously terrible at customer service. For peasant women, the morning could begin with carrying heavy wooden buckets from a village well or nearby stream. Depending on where they lived, that might mean several trips every single day. Water was needed for drinking, cooking, washing, brewing ale, feeding livestock, and cleaning. Every drop reached the house because someone physically carried it there. Modern fitness influencers would probably market it as functional strength training. The medieval woman simply called it Tuesday. Once the water arrived, breakfast still wasn't ready. Grain had to be ground into flour if supplies were running low. Porridge needed cooking. Bread required baking or reheating. Cheese, onions, beans, or leftovers from the previous evening might complete the meal. Every ingredient represented hours of labour long before it reached the table. Even eating was the result of planning that stretched across entire seasons. Then came the endless maintenance that kept a household alive. Clothing needed patching because buying new garments was expensive. Wool required spinning before it could become thread. Linen had to be washed by hand using water. Soap made from animal fat and ash, and an extraordinary amount of patience. Meanwhile, children were everywhere. Some were helping, some believed they were helping. History rarely tells us which group was larger. The work didn't stop inside the home. During planting and harvest seasons, women spent countless hours in the fields alongside men, sowing crops, gathering vegetables, collecting fruit, tending gardens, and caring for livestock. Chickens wandered underfoot. Geese loudly announced absolutely everything. Pigs displayed remarkable confidence, despite contributing almost nothing until much later in life. Every season brought different responsibilities. Spring demanded planting. Summer meant endless labour in growing fields. Autumn revolved around harvesting and preserving food before winter arrived. Winter itself became a careful balancing act of rationing supplies, while continuing countless indoor tasks. There were no quiet months, only different kinds of busy. Looking back, it's tempting to imagine medieval women as simply hard-working. That almost understates the reality. They weren't just hard-working. They were the engines that kept medieval society running, often before everyone else had even finished waking up. One of the quickest ways to misunderstand the Middle Ages is to imagine the husband making every decision, while his wife quietly nodded in agreement somewhere in the background. Reality was considerably less convenient. The medieval household functioned less like a dictatorship and more like a business that desperately needed two capable managers. If one stopped working, the entire operation could collapse with surprising speed. Unlike today, there was no insurance company, repair service, supermarket, or emergency delivery waiting to rescue a family from poor planning. Every household was essentially its own small enterprise, and medieval women were often its chief operating officers. A typical home had inventories to manage, food supplies to monitor, livestock to care for, tools to maintain, clothing to produce and repair, servants or labourers to supervise if the family could afford them, and children to raise into productive adults before they discovered creative new ways to accidentally injure themselves. Children, it turns out, have always been remarkably inventive. A capable wife knew exactly how much grain remained in storage without opening every sack. She understood how many eggs the hens usually produced each week, which cow gave the richest milk, how much firewood would survive a harsh winter, and whether it was time to slaughter a pig before feeding it became more expensive than keeping it alive. That wasn't trivia. It was economics. Modern households worry about monthly budgets. Medieval households worried about whether February would arrive before the cheese ran out. Money itself was only part of the equation. Much of medieval wealth existed in the form of land, animals, stored food, tools, cloth, and labour. Managing those resources required constant attention because nearly everything depended on the weather. A few weeks of heavy rain could ruin crops. A disease among livestock could erase years of careful planning. One failed harvest might affect an entire village. There wasn't much room for careless decisions, which is why practical intelligence earned enormous respect. In towns and cities, wives often worked directly alongside their husbands. Bakers' wives baked. Blacksmiths' wives kept accounts, negotiated with customers, purchased materials, and sometimes helped with production. Brewers' wives produced ale that neighbours bought regularly. Market stalls were frequently run by entire families, with women handling sales as confidently as anyone else. If her husband left for several weeks or months, the business usually didn't close. She simply continued running it. Among the nobility, the responsibilities became even larger. A lady of a great estate might oversee dozens of servants, hundreds of acres of farmland, rents from tenants, food stores, legal disputes, repairs to buildings, and correspondence with neighbouring lords. When her husband travelled to court or joined a military campaign, someone still had to ensure the estate remained profitable. That someone was usually her. So when people picture medieval women as standing quietly behind powerful men, history offers a gentle correction. Quite often, they were standing beside them. And every so often, they were standing in front, reminding everyone that somebody actually needed to keep the place running. Long before smartphones remembered birthdays, maps remembered directions, and search engines remembered absolutely everything else. Medieval women relied on a remarkable piece of technology, their memory, and it had to be good. There was no notebook hanging on the kitchen wall listing supplies for the week. No calendar reminding anyone that winter was only a few months away. No helpful recipe website explaining how to preserve meat or make cheese. Most ordinary women couldn't simply reach for a written manual, and even those who could read often lived in households where books were expensive enough to be treated almost like family treasures. Knowledge lived inside people's heads, especially hers. A medieval woman needed to remember which field had produced the best harvest the previous year, when certain herbs should be gathered, how long smoked meat would remain edible, which hens laid the most eggs, which neighbours could be trusted to return borrowed tools, and which ones mysteriously developed permanent ownership whenever they borrowed a shovel. Some traditions truly stand the test of time. She also remembered family histories, marriages, debts, promises, feast days, local customs, recipes, remedies, and enough practical information to keep an entire household alive through changing seasons. For many families, she became the household archive. If someone asked how much grain remained after last winter, she knew. If someone wondered whether enough wool had been spun to make new clothing before autumn, she knew. If someone questioned whether the family had already paid rent to the local lord, she definitely knew. Convenient memory loss was surprisingly difficult around people like that. Memory also meant experience. Every year added another collection of lessons about weather, crops, illnesses, childbirth, livestock, and human nature. Older women became respected not simply because they were older, but because decades of observation had transformed into practical wisdom. Young people often learned by watching them. Occasionally they also learned by ignoring them first. History suggests the second method was generally more painful. Many remedies, cooking techniques, and household skills were never written down at all. Mothers taught daughters. Grandmothers taught grandchildren. Neighbours exchanged advice during long hours of spinning wool or working together at harvest time. Entire generations passed knowledge forward through conversation and repetition. It wasn't a formal education, yet it was astonishingly effective. Today we become mildly uncomfortable if the internet disappears for 20 minutes. A medieval woman could lose an entire written library and still remember enough information to keep a family fed, clothed, and healthy, because the most valuable reference book was already stored in her mind. So if you arrived hoping to impress everyone by recalling a few interesting facts, you might discover an unfortunate truth. She wasn't competing in a trivia contest. She was carrying an encyclopedia, and unlike yours, hers had already been tested by real life. If you've ever imagined medieval women quietly agreeing with everything their husbands said, history would like to file a formal complaint. The Middle Ages were full of disagreements. Families argued over land, inheritance, livestock, marriage arrangements, borrowed tools, unpaid debts, wandering pigs, broken fences, and whose sheep had once again demonstrated an impressive talent for ignoring property boundaries. Since most people lived in tightly connected communities where everyone knew everyone else, simply storming away forever wasn't really an option. You would almost certainly see the same people tomorrow, and the day after that, probably at church. Arguments, therefore, had to accomplish something. A capable medieval woman quickly learned that shouting rarely solved practical problems. Persuasion, memory, patience, and occasionally a perfectly timed look of disappointment could prove far more effective. History never records the exact power of that look. Perhaps scribes were afraid to describe it. Many women became remarkably skilled negotiators because daily life demanded it. They bargained with merchants over prices, discussed rents with landlords, arranged marriages with neighbouring families, managed servants, settled disputes among children, and occasionally reminded husbands that buying another horse before repairing the barn might not represent the strongest financial strategy. Medieval bookkeeping often happened entirely inside someone's head. Ignoring the person who remembered every expense was generally considered unwise. Within villages, reputation mattered almost as much as money. A family known for honesty found it easier to borrow equipment, receive help during harvest, or arrange favourable marriages. A family known for constant quarrels often discovered that neighbours suddenly became very busy whenever assistance was needed. Strangely enough, this remains one of history's more enduring traditions. Women played a huge role in protecting that reputation. Every conversation at the village well, every market visit, every church gathering quietly strengthened or weakened a family's standing within the community. Words carried surprising weight. Once spoken, they travelled faster than anyone on horseback. In noble households, diplomacy became even more important. Ladies welcomed important guests, oversaw feasts, maintained relationships with neighbouring families, and helped preserve political alliances. A careless insult at dinner could create problems lasting years. A thoughtful conversation could prevent them entirely. Being gracious wasn't merely polite. It was practical politics. This is one reason medieval literature so often praises wisdom alongside beauty. Intelligence wasn't simply attractive, it was useful. The woman who could calm a disagreement before it became a feud might save her family from years of unnecessary conflict. Meanwhile, if you entered an argument armed with confidence but very few facts, you probably wouldn't enjoy the outcome. She remembered exactly who promised what, who failed to keep that promise, what happened the last 3 times someone suggested your brilliant idea, and why repeating it would almost certainly end the same way. In other words, long before modern debates included screenshots and receipts, she already had both. only they were stored in her memory instead of her phone. Modern dating often begins with carefully chosen photos, witty messages, and hoping nobody notices you accidentally liked a picture from 4 years ago. Medieval courtship was rather less forgiving. There was no opportunity to create an impressive first impression online because there was no online. There wasn't much room for pretending to be someone else either. Your neighbours had probably known you since childhood. Your family reputation followed you everywhere, and if you claimed to be hard-working, there were at least 20 people nearby who could immediately confirm whether that was true, or laugh. Mostly laugh. Finding a husband or wife wasn't simply about romance. Marriage was one of the most important economic